Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. With me again with the different material. Today we are going to learn about passive voice part 1. Before we go on to deeply know about passive voice, I'm going to give you some differences between active and passive voice. Voice is a verb form that indicates whether the sentence's subject performs or receives an action. If the subject performs an action, it is an active voice. If the subject receives an action, it is a passive voice. Okay, there are two types of voices. The first one is active voice, and the second one is passive voice. Active voice. In the active voice, the sentence's subject performs an action, like the pilot landed the plane tonight. The pilot as the subject, landed as the verb, the plane as the object, tonight as adverb, complement. In this sentence, the pilot performs an action, that is, landed the plane. So, this sentence is considered as active. Simon has painted the house. Simon as subject, has painted as verb, the house as object. Simon, in this case, also performs an action, that is, has painted the house. So, this sentence is also an active sentence. The second one is passive voice. A sentence is considered as a passive voice if the sentence's subject receives the action. Passive sentences often indicate that what happens is more important than who is responsible. So, by agent or by phrase is frequently dropped in passive sentences, like the plane was landed tonight. There is no by agent or by phrase because the one who is responsible is less important than what happens. Or in some cases, it's already known who is responsible, so it is not necessary to mention. The house has been painted. In this sentence, there is no by phrase or by agent because it is not important or because it is already known who is responsible. A sentence written in active voice and having a transitive verb, meaning that it has an object, can be turned around to make it passive. So, in this case, before you want to change a sentence into passive, make sure that the active sentence has an object. If there is no object, the active sentence cannot be changed into passive. For example, Jane eats noodle. Jane as the subject, eats as the verb, noodle as the object. In this sentence, Jane performs an action, that is eating noodle, so it is constitute an active sentence. Because this sentence has an object, it can be turned around into passive. For the passive one, it must be noodle is eaten by Jane. The object of the active becomes the subject of the passive. And for the verb, it must be in the form of to be plus verb 3. And the object, it must be in the form of by agent. For the object, by Jane is in the form of by phrase or by agent. Noodle is eaten by Jane is the passive of Jane eats noodle. Forming the passive. To change an active sentence to passive, it depends on the structures that are used in the active, whether it is simple present, present progressive, present perfect, and so on and so on. There are 16 tenses in English, so there are 16 ways to form the passive sentence from the active. Like for example, simple present, N writes a letter. In this sentence, N as subject writes as verb, a letter as object. Because this sentence has an object, it can be changed into passive. The object from the active sentence become the subject of the passive, and the verb must be in the form of to be plus verb 3, and then for the object of passive comes from the subject in the form of by agent or by phrase, by N. A letter is written by N. Yeah, for how to make passive from active in certain tenses, you may read yourselves the forms or the ways how to make it. The next tenses: simple future for will and be going to, future progressive will, future progressive be going to, future perfect be going to. You may read yourselves the passive sentences from active sentences. And then future perfect progressive will and future perfect progressive be going to. And will have been writing a letter becomes a letter will have been being written by N. And is going to have been writing a letter becomes a letter is going to have been being written by N. Don't forget to add being if it is progressive. Okay, we go on to the next material. It is about forms or structures or formulas for passive voices. There are 16 tenses in English. For simple present, the formula must be is or are plus past participle. And for continuous, is or are being plus past participle. Simple past, was or were plus past participle. And for continuous, was or were being plus past participle. Don't forget to add being for all continuous. For the examples, you can read yourselves. And we go on to the next formula. Present perfect simple has or have been plus past participle. And then for continuous, has or have been being plus past participle. Then for past perfect, had been plus past participle. For continuous, had been being plus past participle. Then for future, will be plus past participle. And for continuous, will be being plus past participle. And for infinitive 2 plus verb 1. For passive voices, it must be to be plus past participle. The example, I don't want to be arrested. We shouldn't be arrested. So for infinitive, just add to be, real be, to be. I don't want to be arrested. Arrested, verb 3 or past participle. And then for gerund, he doesn't like being told what to do. He as the subject does not like as the verb. And then after the verb, it must be a noun. A noun that comes from a verb is called as gerund. If we want to make a noun from a verb in the form of a passive voice, you can use this formula. Being plus past participle. Like he doesn't like being told what to do. Okay, for the examples, you may read yourselves. There are some notes. The first one, the passive is frequently used to describe scientific or mechanical processes or informal explanation. The example, the passive is frequently used blah blah. So for scientific or mechanical processes, the passive sentences are preferred rather than the active. because something that happened is more important than the one who is responsible. That may be one of the reasons why passive is preferred in scientific or mechanical processes. And the second note, it is not essential to repeat the auxiliary verb, in this case to be, in a list of processes. The cars are washed, cleaned, checked, and then driven to the port. To be is placed before the first past participle. The complete one is the cars are washed, are cleaned, are checked, and then are driven to the port. But you do not need to place all the same to be with the different verb. You just put the to be before the first past participle. The cars are washed, cleaned, checked, and then driven to the port. It's already understandable, and that is very concise. Okay, then the next, as the previous explanation, there are 16 structures or formulas. It is very difficult to memorize all of those 16 formulas. And of course, it takes time. Perhaps this easy way can help you in some cases. I'm going to explain how this easy way can be a help for you. Remember the basic structure of passive voice, that is to be plus past participle of verb 3. The first, make sure that the active sentence has an object. If the active sentence has an object, it can be changed into passive. If there is no object in the active sentence, you cannot change it into passive. So make sure that the sentence can be changed into passive. And then the second one, use the object of the active sentence as the subject of the passive. After making sure that the sentence has an object, then put the object of the active in the place of the subject for the passive. For example, she writes a letter. First, determine whether this active sentence has an object. She as the subject, writes as the verb, a letter as the object. We can find an object of this active sentence. After that, the object must be placed in the passive. Which one is the object? A letter. So a letter is the subject of the passive. And then the third way, use the correct to be with some consideration. I'm going to explain it in a brief. Then we come to the next slide to the more complete explanation. The correct to be, in this case, means that if the subject of the passive is singular, you must use the to be for singular subject. If the subject of the passive is plural, you must use to be for plural. Besides, you must also have a look at the structure. If the structure of the active sentence is in the form of simple present, you must use the to be for a singular subject and for simple present. A letter is a singular subject and it is a thing. So the to be that can be used is the to be is. Why? Because the subject is a singular subject and the structure that is used in the active sentence is present. Singular subject it, and the structure that is used in the active sentence is simple present. So the to be that must be used in the passive sentence is the to be is. Okay, so a letter is. Okay, that is a brief explanation before we come to the next slide in a complete one. And then the next way, use the correct past participle of the verb. Yeah. The verb that is used in active sentence is writes. In this case, writes must be changed into past participle. Write, wrote, written. So the verb that must be used in passive is written. A letter is written. And then use the subject of active sentence as the object or by agent or by phrase of the passive. Now have a look at the subject of the active sentence. She. She is a subjective pronoun. This pronoun must be changed into objective pronoun if it is preceded by preposition, because after preposition it must be the object of a preposition. So the pronoun that must be used is an objective pronoun. And before the pronoun you must add by. A letter is written by her. Okay, that is the example of how to change from active to passive. Okay, once again, remember when you want to change the active to passive in the form of progressive, don't forget to add being. For example, she is writing a letter becomes a letter is being written by her. We come to the next one, that is some considerations in determining the correct to be for the passive. First, determine whether the subject of the passive is singular or plural. Have a look at the subject. The subject of the passive comes from the object of the active sentence. Then determine whether the subject of the passive is in form of singular or plural. And then determine whether the structure used is in the form of present. If the structure in the active sentence is in the form of present, the to be's that can be used are am is are. Am for first person, is for third person singular, are for third person plural. If the structure of the active sentence is in the form of simple past, the to be's that can be used are was for both first person and third person singular, were for third person plural. And then if the structure in the active sentence is simple future, the to be that must be used is be, the real be. For example, Anne will write a letter. A letter will be written by Anne. So the real be after the modal, it must be followed by real be. For the perfect, the to be that must be used is been. After the auxiliary have or has or had, have has for present, had for past, and then after that, in the passive sentence, it must be followed by been before the verb 3 or past participle. And then the third way, see whether the structure used in the form of progressive. If the structure that is used in active sentence is in the form of progressive, you must add being after the to be. If yes, the pattern must be to be, being, and past participle. Okay, let's give you an example. Anne wrote a letter. Have a look at the sentence. Anne is subject, wrote as verb, a letter is object. In this case, Anne performs an action, that is writing a letter. So this sentence is an active sentence. After that, have a look at the sentence again, whether the sentence has an object or not. Yes, there is an object, a letter. So because this sentence has an object, it can be changed into passive. How to change this active to passive? Consider these questions. First, what is the object? The object is a letter. Second, is it singular or plural? it is a singular subject. What is the structure used? The structure that is used is simple past. So the to be for singular subject and simple past is was. Then the next one, is it progressive or not? No, it is not progressive. So you do not need to add being. The next question, what is the past participle of the verb? The verb is wrote. Wrote comes from write. Write, wrote, written. So the verb that must be used in passive is written. Then the last question, what is the subject? The subject of the active is an. This subject must be placed in the form of by agent or by phrase functioning as the object of the passive. So the object of the passive must be by an. This is the passive one. A letter was written by Anne is the passive sentence from Anne wrote a letter. The next example. First, have a look at the sentence. Anne has been writing a letter. Anne as subject has been writing as verb, a letter as object. And here performs an action, that is, has been writing a letter. So it is an active sentence. And have a look at the sentence again, whether the sentence has an object or not. Yes, it has. That is a letter. So because it has an object, it can be changed into passive. The question is how? How to change this active sentence to passive? So consider some questions. First, what is the object? The object is a letter. So a letter must be the subject of the passive. Then the second question, is it singular or plural? Is it a singular subject? Singular subject for it. And then, what is the structure used? The structure that is used in the active sentence is present, perfect, progressive. In the passive sentence, you must use the same structure. So, because a letter is a singular, the auxiliary that is used in the passive is still has. A letter has. And because it is progressive, we must still use been. Has been. And then the next question, don't forget to consider whether the structure of the active sentence is in the form of progressive or not. Take a look at the sentence. It is in the form of a progressive. Present perfect progressive. If it is progressive, don't forget to use being. So, has been being. And then the next question, what is the past participle of the verb? The verb that is used in the active sentence is write. Write, wrote, and written. So, written is the past participle of the verb. And then the next question, what is the subject of the active? And is the subject of the active must be the object of the passive in the form of by phrase or by agent. So it must be by an. So for the passive one, a letter has been being written by an. One more example. Anne is going to have read some novels. Anne is the subject, is going to have read is the verb, and some novels is the object. In this sentence, Anne is performing an action, that is reading some novel. So it is an active sentence. And again, take a look at the sentence, whether the sentence has an object or not. Yes, the sentence has an object, that is some novels. Because it has an object, again, it can be changed into passive. How to change it? As before, consider some questions. First, what is the object? The object is some novels. And then, is it singular or plural? It is a plural subject. What is the structure used? The structure is be going to. It is in the form of future be going to. After be going to, we can find out an auxiliary have, so it is in the form of future perfect. For the second and the third question, the subject is a plural subject and the structure is future perfect. For the passive, the structure must be the same as the active sentence. For be going to must be changed to plural subject. Some novels are going to have. After have must be added by been, because the to be for the perfect is been. Are going to have been. The next question, is it progressive or not? No, it is not progressive. You do not need to add being. And what is the past participle of the verb? Yeah, read comes from the first verb read. The same spelling, different pronunciation. Read, read, read. So the verb must be read. And then the next example, what is the subject? The subject of the active is and must be placed in the object of the passive in the form of by phrase or by agent, by an. Some novels are going to have been read by an is the passive form of and is going to have read some novels. Okay, up to this, I believe that some of you have already understood my explanation, but some others perhaps are still confused. Don't worry. It is the process of learning. After this explanation, you still have some questions. You can write down your question in the comment box below the video. I'm going to give you some responses for the question. Okay. Then using the passive. The passive is usually used without a by phrase or by agent since it is not known or not important to know exactly who performs an action. For some cases, an active verb that is not known who performs an action, or when it is not important to mention the doer, by phrase or by agent is not necessary to mention. Like rice is grown in India. In this sentence, by phrase or by agent is dropped because it is not important to know. Second one, our house was built in 1980. Common use of the passive without by phrase because it is not necessary to mention, so by phrase is dropped. Or perhaps we do not know who performs an action, by phrase is not mentioned. Okay, then if the speaker knows who performs an action, usually the active is used. If we know already who performs an action, the active one is frequently used. But we must make sure the event or the process or the action is not really important than the doer. If what happens or the event is more important than who performs an action, a passive is preferred. But if the event or what happens is not more important than the doer, and we know already who performs an action, an active is frequently used. We come to indirect object as passive subjects. Have a look at the example. Someone gave Mrs. Lee an award. Someone as the subject, give as the verb, Mrs. Lee as indirect object, and award as direct object. There are two objects in the sentence, indirect and direct. The question is how to differentiate between indirect object and direct object. Indirect object is answering the question to whom. It is frequently the person. For direct object, it tells us a thing and it is answering the question what. What is given by someone. And for indirect object, to whom and a what is given by someone. Indirect object, again, is answering the question to whom. for direct object is answering the question what. And the second one, indirect object is frequently in the form of person, though it can be a thing also. For direct object is in the form of a thing, though in some cases it can also be a person. Someone gave Mrs. Lee an award. Have a look at this sentence. Someone as the subject, gave as the verb, Mrs. Lee as indirect object, and award as direct object. The subject in this case performs an action, so it is in the form of an active sentence. If you want to change this into passive, you must consider the two objects. If the indirect object comes directly after the verb, this indirect object must be the subject of the passive. And the direct object is still in the position of an object. Mrs. Lee was given an award. So in this case, remember that the object which comes directly after the verb is the subject of the passive voice. Okay, the next example. For the second example, someone gave an award to Mrs. Lee. Someone as subject, gave as the verb, and award as the direct object, Mrs. Lee as indirect object. Again, remember that direct object is answering the question of what is given by someone. Indirect object is answering the question of to whom something is given by someone, for example like that. Have a look at the sentence. Someone gave an award to Mrs. Lee. Have a look at the subject. The subject is performing an action, that is giving an award to Mrs. Lee. So this sentence is an active sentence. There are two objects of the sentence, so we can change it into passive. If we want to change this sentence into passive, have a look at the two objects. The object which comes directly after the verb, that is in this case direct object, becomes the subject of the passive. So the subject of the passive is an award because an award comes directly after the verb in the active sentence. An award was given to Mrs. Lee, while the indirect object still becomes the object of the passive. A, B, C, and D have the same meaning. Notice in D, when the direct object becomes the subject, to is usually kept in front of the indirect object. If the direct object comes directly after the verb, you must use to before the indirect object. Remember this. If the direct object comes directly after the verb, you must use to between direct object and indirect object. But if the indirect object comes directly after the verb, you do not need to between indirect object and direct object. The next, forming the passive modals and phrasal modals. There are some modals: will, would, can, could, shall, should, may, might, and so on and so on. There are some phrasal modals like be going to, be supposed to, ought to, had better, and so on and so on. If you want to change an active form in the form of modal or phrasal modal, you may just add be after the modal or phrasal modal. Like the first example, the window cannot be opened. So it is the passive form of someone cannot open the window. To change it into passive, you just add be, real be. The real be plus verb 3. The window cannot be opened by someone. By someone is dropped because it is not necessary to mention. The window cannot be opened. Be is placed after the modals. And for phrasal modal, like Fred is supposed to be told about the meeting. Be is placed after the phrasal modal and before verb 3. This is the verb 3. The other examples can be read yourselves. Okay, that's it. Thank you. This is my explanation about passive voice part 1. And thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to study a lot at home. Keep healthy and be safe. And wait for the next videos. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.